In the early years, the early decades of the 20th century, Charles Fort, who was an eccentric American writer, collected these reports and reports of other kinds of extraordinary anomalies, natural or paranatural. And in a book published in 1919 called The Book of the Damned, actually presented the first draft of what would be called the extraterrestrial hypothesis, theorizing that these events and these sites and these reports suggested the presence of otherworldly visitors. When UFOs appeared and became an international sensation in the summer of 1947 and after that, within days of Kenneth Arnold's sighting on June 24th, 1947, speculation about Martian visitors began to appear in the press. Almost all of it came from people who had read Charles Fort's book. Charles Fort himself had died in 1932. But that was the people who first thought these things could be from outer space. Otherwise, people thought they were Russian experiments or secret aircraft experiments of the Navy, or there were all kinds of natural explanations. Some people thought they were an artifact of atomic testing and so on. Not very many people, except the followers of Charles Fort, were thinking about spaceships from other planets. But eventually, by the mid-1950s, the association of UFOs and extraterrestrial visitors was quite widespread, but it wasn't automatic and natural. It took a while. In fact, some of the first people who thought that UFOs could be extraterrestrial spacecraft were in the Air Force, because people in the Air Force understood just how extraordinary the apparent technology of these things was. They knew that there was no earthly power that could duplicate that technology. They understood that in a way the general public probably didn't.
Well, no one truly knows exactly what was going on. However, we know that since T2 Intelligence was doing aeronautical analysis from the German technology that they brought back from World War II, from the Russians, that these objects obviously were not coming from Russia, nor were they coming from the stash of old aircraft and the Horton brothers and things in Germany at the time. So they could only come to one conclusion. They're not ours, they're not theirs, they're from somewhere else. And this kind of put a big kibosh on the military careers of many of the people at T2 Intelligence at Wright Field.
According to the story, all the copies of the estimate of the situation were destroyed, but that couldn't have been true because, as a matter of fact, we have several people who said they saw one, including Captain Ruppelt himself and the Pentagon's major person at the so-called UFO desk in 1952, Major Dewey Fournet.
They said that it was interplanetary and that it was intelligently controlled and interplanetary. Fournet, who saw the whole document, said, listen, these guys were trying to shake the tree up in Washington. This was a preliminary thing, and he said he didn't see that he read the report, he didn't see that they had the evidence to make this conclusion. But it's an estimate of the situation. 10 minutes after you write, I worked in intelligence. 10 minutes after you write an estimate of the situation, it's stale.
The first major UFO proponent was a retired Marine Corps major named Donald Keyhoe. Keyhoe worked in the Pentagon. He had once been an aide to Colonel Charles Lindbergh. He had all kinds of contacts. He was a popular writer. He wrote stories, adventure stories in pulp magazines, usually with an aviation theme.
He also wrote fiction stories about World War I flying. And I read those things every time they came out. 10 cents a copy of pulp magazines, beautiful things.
So when True Magazine, which was a very popular men's magazine back years and years ago, decided that it wanted to look into the question of what flying saucers were, it thought, well, Don Keyhoe is a good guy. He's got all these Pentagon contacts. He knows about aviation, knows a lot of pilots, and many pilots are reporting UFOs. So he spent about 8 months investigating the story for True Magazine, and The article that he published in the January 1950 issue of True was titled "The Flying Saucers Are Real."
And Donald Keyhoe became probably the most important person in the history of UFOs. That article, which came at the very end of the year, was sort of a psychological bomb for many people because it seemed to expose a hypocrisy in Air Force intelligence, and not only that, seemed to rather clearly point to the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
When he was making a discussion with me, and he was essentially telling me, that I was not doing the right thing to the job. And I told him that, well, in a way, it's your fault. Because if you hadn't written those stories and gotten me so interested in the Air Force, I wouldn't be here.
Did they make you want to be a pilot or something?
Yes, it did.
Keyhoe concluded from interviewing his Air Force contacts, interviewing pilots, other credible witnesses, that flying saucers were coming to Earth probably from Mars. That sounds rather ridiculous today, but in those days, even many reputable scientists thought it was at least possible that Mars harbored an intelligent civilization. This was before the space probes and other advances told us that this was not possible. But at the time, it was considered a reasonable speculation that Mars was inhabited. Keyhoe thought they were peaceful. They were coming here with good intentions, but they were afraid of us because we had sent our interceptor aircraft after them. And so they were shy about establishing contact. But they were watching us, and they'd started watching us intensely because they began monitoring our atomic bombs. This was a version of the extraterrestrial hypothesis for the UFO age. In 1957, he assumed directorship of an organization called the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which brought together all kinds of people with solid professional and middle-class credentials to argue for interplanetary visitation, to lobby for congressional hearings. NICAP began as a hugely ambitious operation, but the funding that Keyhoe had counted on did not materialize. That's an interesting story in itself. But in the late 1950s, up until the later 1960s, Keyhoe and NICAP represented respectable pro-UFO opinion. And this was at a time when, although there was a great deal of skepticism, the idea that UFOs could be real, even extraterrestrial, was not quite the marginalized idea that it would become in later years.
I think that scientists at the time, despite the interest that was there in possible life in outer space and the knowledge of astronomy and what was possible in terms of solar systems and chemistry in the galaxy, scientists basically had literally no conception that aliens could potentially visit here.
You trust the big paradigm maker at the time. And the big paradigm maker at the time is Einstein, and by gum, you don't go against Einstein. He told you this. He put the 10-pound finger on you. You cannot go faster than the speed of light.
Special relativity and the speed of light, how much impact did that have in scientists' ability to take a look?
I think in considering the possibility of, let's say, ET visitation or even ourselves going out and exploring other stars in the future, even though general relativity had come along and it actually changed that picture, most scientists with an instant response would think on special relativity terms and say, well, the velocity of light is a limitation. You can't go faster than the speed of light. And therefore, to conceive of us exploring stars or other people coming here, it's too far. They just can't get from here to there. We might explore our own solar system, but that's probably as far as we're going to get. But the truth of the matter is that in general relativity, that's not the case. There are options there. And in fact, one of my favorite examples was when Carl Sagan was putting together his book and movie Contact. He wanted to have some kind of more or less instant connection to faraway locales. And so he approached Kip Thorne at Caltech, who was a friend of his, and says, I want this to be as scientifically reasonable as possible. And so Kip decided to look into the possibility out of general relativity that you could beat the speed of light. Well, it turns out that in general relativity, we can begin to talk about manipulating the space-time variables, which was not the case in special relativity. And then, in fact, you could, say, make wormholes, which is sort of be like subways through space or whatever. So he came back and told Carl, no, you can incorporate that. But he got sufficiently interested as a theoretical physicist Kip did, that he began having his graduate students look into these more bizarre outcomes, predictions from general relativity. And so, in fact, they came up with ways that you could beat the speed of light with the so-called wormhole shortcut through space-time. But, of course, now that's become a very legitimate area of general relativity research. And so there's a lot of work going on looking at wormholes, so-called warp drives. In the end, it may turn out that wormholes, there's a possibility of engineering them, and people are still looking at that, at least the principles of it. Warp drive is, as far as we can see, is going to be tough. Well, here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, and so we know there's going to be a 24th and a 28th and a 30th century science. And the scientists of those years are going to look back and see how primitive we were. So really a scientist, if he's up to it, can't rule out anything.
I have several editions of an astronomy textbook out, and I talk about this limit of the speed of light, and I put a footnote in there saying something like, at least according to our current understanding of physics. And I got a moderately irate letter from some scientist, this is outrageous that you would put this in. And I thought, well, how outrageous for him? Is he really on record that our physics of 1987 or whenever this was is the last word? I mean, it doesn't mean you should start assuming things can go fast in light, but you just shouldn't assume that we know everything. And as Arthur Clarke said, any superior intelligence is going to look like magic to us. Exactly. Anything that violates our crude understanding of the universe that we have.
We have to assume that our understanding of the universe
Sure we do, yeah. And you have to be ready for the thing that's out there that violates it.
I'm always reminded back in the late 1890s how the head of the British Academy of Science said, we know it all, we're just wrapping up the details.
And there's who was it Haldane or one of the famous British scientists, the space flight is utter bilge is a famous line.
I mean, I love Planck's phrase, which can be paraphrased. That is, how does science go forward? And he says, funeral by funeral.
So I really don't think it was only light speed. Again, it was more sociological, psychological, and philosophical reasoning that led scientists to reject UFO sightings. Now, there's another one there too. This is a corollary to the if we don't know it, if we aren't aware of it, it can't be true. We the scientists, will not use data that comes from the public, that comes from the great unwashed. And of course, physicists and astronomers, well, at least the physicists don't ever do this, or chemists. Astronomers do a little bit with amateur astronomers, but other scientists don't, and they're just not used to saying, well, we could be getting some valuable evidence from people who are out there.
One of the themes that comes out in the early history of ufology was that the UFOs weren't actually there for investigation, but the people who reported them were. And this is what led to a whole group of psychological kinds of interpretations, and then they were essentially negative ones. The person's stupid, they're lying, they're drunk, they don't know what they're talking about, they're crazy. And then you let off the hook, right? There's no real challenge to science. There's no real challenge to what you currently believe, because it's this person's problem, something wrong with them. So we don't have to rethink things like interstellar travel, interdimensionality, whatever, might or might not be out there.
There was a terrific example of this that's in my chapter in there, and it was a Russian spacecraft satellite called Zond 4, I think it was. And that was a big rocket booster, and that re-entered over the United States, came in through the atmosphere, as we know from modern films and the disastrous shuttle breakup and things like that. These things come in, start to glow, they get hot from friction with the atmosphere, they start to break up just like a meteorite or a fireball, and you get a string of fragments. And I've actually seen one of these. I saw one of the shuttle tanks re-enter over Hawaii once, and it's amazing. It's remarkable. It's like a big mass of fireworks. The one I saw, they were all kind of sparkling, and they're moving across the sky together because there's like the big piece out in front and some smaller pieces behind, and they're slowly spreading out. But what you see moving across the sky is that string of lights together, and we could say that's the perception in this case. Now, I was given on the Condon Commission a folder of what I remember is something like 150 or 200 reports of this. And one of the strangest things I experienced there was that, in general, the people who knew what they were looking at, the people who said, gee, that must be a satellite re-entering the atmosphere and breaking up, they gave the shortest and crispest reports. I saw this bright thing, some lights in the sky. I think maybe it was a satellite breaking up. It's kind of the end of the story. The people who most badly misconceived it, they conceived that they saw something else, gave the most elaborate and detailed reports. And some great examples of that. There were even a progression of stages. There were the people who, as I say, the people who said, oh, this is satellite, end of story. Then there were the people who were describing what they saw, and they said, I saw a string of lights in a kind of in a line moving across the sky. Well, that's basically absolutely accurate. Great example of the perception correctly reported as a conception, and so on. Then there were people who started introducing a very subtle difference. There were people who said, I saw a set of lights flying in formation across the sky. A little bit of a different idea there.
Yeah.
It's the idea that somehow they're under control. I just was re-looking at that chapter that I wrote, and I noticed there was a person who said they were flying in perfect military formation. Now, if you know what he saw, that's not a bad description. But on the other hand, if you come in and you're talking to this guy the next day and he says, I saw these things flying in military formation, you think, well, were these really a bunch of different craft flying along in military formation? That's not what he saw, but that's his conception. Right. And then finally, we get to this end, as I say, with the detailed descriptions. There were people who said, I saw a black cigar-shaped object with a row of lights. And of course, they didn't see the black cigar-shaped object. They conceived that it had to be there, because there had to be something for those lights to be attached to. Then there were the people who said, I saw a black cigar-shaped object with a row of lighted windows. And we absolutely had reports like that. And then the last two or three that were the furthest off, I saw the cigar-shaped object, the windows. It was so close we could have seen people inside the windows if there had been anybody in there. My dog was barking and whimpering, and there were fires in the fields outside of town the next day, and all of that. And you come in as either an experienced and maybe an inexperienced UFO investigator, looking for reports of alien craft. Those sound like pretty good reports. And so, they're all the same thing, and they were all a satellite breaking up in the atmosphere. So really tough to translate those into real understanding.
As proof of the extraterrestrial hypothesis remained elusive, some ufologists began to look in other directions. And some of the more Fortean-inclined ufologists, the ones who were attracted to the idea that UFOs were part of a broad range of anomalies and mysteries, speculation grew that there weren't extraterrestrial visitors, that these were actually paranormal entities who...
This around what year, Drew?
In the 1960s, about the mid-1960s, the idea begins to form that UFOs really aren't what they appear to be. They may not even be craft. They may not even represent a technology in the ordinarily understood sense of those words, that these were actually shape-shifting entities from some unknown other world, a parallel universe, a demonic realm, something like that. And there was an attempt to link flying saucers not only with other weird phenomena that people reported, like strange creatures and so on, but also to traditional folkloric entities like fairies and angels and demons, which were also interpreted as not literal entities, but as representations of kind of cultural expectations about supernatural experience. These things existed in some sense. The experiences of them were real, but excuse me.
Okay, no problem.
But they weren't what they appeared to be. That they really were something else, representing some kind of unknown other reality. The most influential writers in this new school were Jacques Vallée and John Keel. In 1969, Jacques Vallée wrote a book called Passport to Magonia, where he links modern UFOs to traditional beliefs about fairies, demons, gods, entities of various kinds.
At the time Passport to Magonia was published, it was looked on more as an ancient astronaut type text rather than a real subversion of the whole extraterrestrial hypothesis. Most people read it and said, well, okay, the aliens must have been around from time immemorial. This is just more evidence for the same. But in fact, what Vallée was saying was something quite different, was that the UFOs are just a part of some larger mystery.
John Keel, who was much less intellectually sophisticated, but just as influential as Vallée, wrote several books in which he revived traditional demonology. And he argued that UFOs and their entities and all kinds of other strange creatures were literally demonic entities. He didn't say they were from hell, but he renamed hell the superspectrum. The superspectrum was also related to the traditional occult idea of the etheric realm, a realm on another level of vibrational frequency.
It did sort of mesh with the spirit of the times. The idea of getting away from technology, scientists and government as the good guys, which you see in all those 1950s monster outer space movies. The heroes are always scientists and soldiers. Complete revolution there. They become the villains. And the counterculture, the notion of a new age, belief in a more spiritual sort of thing becomes very popular. So this idea of Vallée is that there might be some kind of mysterious force in almost a Star Wars sense.
The control mechanism.
Yeah, is out there and is responsible for many manifestations of the paranormal. That quickly caught on.
Now, to critics, this was really an abdication of reason, logic, and science, that this was really a reversion to magical thinking and a rejection of science and reason as the right tools with which to investigate phenomena. But the absence of conclusive proof for these, extraordinary phenomena was very frustrating to a lot of people. And some people had come to this less as scientists than as mystery mongers. They weren't really hard, clear thinkers. Vallée was trained as a scientist. Vallée was trained as an astrophysicist. Vallée was intellectually sophisticated and not as inclined to rank paranoia as Keel and his followers were, but still underlying his reading of what was going on was really magical thinking that really had as much to do with traditional occultism as with science. Out of the paranormal school of ufological theory, there evolved the so-called psychosocial hypothesis, which actually rejected paranormal processes, but did see UFO reports and experiences as part of a broad range of folkloric, supernatural phenomena. But instead of ascribing them to demons or parallel universes or some other unknowable place, held them to be psychological phenomena, sometimes extraordinary psychological phenomena. This school really grew among European ufologists, and to this day is fairly popular in Europe, representing a kind of skeptical ufology, which is making its own variety of extraordinary claims.
They tend very much to look for answers in what you might call tradition. The idea that that certain ideas have been passed along. They want to find cultural antecedents. Here's the same imagery as abductions. We can find it in science fiction. We can find it in stories of fairy kidnap. You can find it in all sorts of cultural predecessors. That doesn't mean that there's some kind of organizing force. It just means that it has something to do with the way we think and believe. Right. And there's really no mysterious unknown phenomenon involved.
Critics of paranormal and psychosocial approaches to UFO theory pointed out that there is a body of physical evidence for the presence of something anomalous that seems irreducible, that doesn't seem amenable to prosaic explanation or to being contained within known knowledge at this stage. And so they would respond to psychosocial theorists and paranormalists as saying, this isn't all just airy-fairy stuff. This isn't all subjective. There actually is some objective evidence that something strange is going on. And the paranormalists and the psychosocial skeptics could never really adequately rebut this argument. And eventually, some ufologists who had gone over to the paranormal or psychosocial side said, yes, the physical evidence is really the core evidence. It really is at the core of the controversy.
It's amazing how quickly galaxies have formed. The Hubble Space Telescope did a couple of very deep surveys, very long exposures, to look for the most distant clusters and individual galaxies, and found that galaxies formed sometime around the first billion-year age of the universe. And so that means the stars, of course, which constitute galaxies, have been around that long. So a civilization could be rather old. You have to assume, of course, that evolution took place, and that takes some time. But certainly civilizations at least 1 billion years older than ours are theoretically possible, maybe even much older than that.
The first one generation of stars has to go by, I think 4 to 5 billion years for heavy elements?
It depends. I mean, the very heaviest stars evolve pretty quickly. They evolve in time scales of even less than 1 billion years. Oh. So it's possible that there could be civilizations that are very, very old.
What would the limit, you think, be?
Well, just say 10 billion years. That'd be about twice as old as the...
a civilization could be 10 billion years, or?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, if a civilization evolved during the first, say, 4 billion years of existence of the universe, then that's not out of the question. More conservatives say it's easy to imagine a civilization at least 1 billion years older than we are. Yeah. Leave it at that. 10 billion, well, it's kind of stretching it, but it's not out of the question in my view.
The universe is really old compared to our age. Not super old, because you can imagine one 1 trillion years old, and we're not nearly close to that, but it's pretty old. And what that means is, and particularly with recent astronomical discoveries, is that in fact the average civilization in the galaxy, how can I even speak of that? Because just pick the average age of a planet like Earth. In other words, in a solar system, what would be the average age of a solar system, or like a sun-like solar system? The answer is 1 billion years older than ours. So when you start imagining what a 1 billion-year-old civilization would be like, the answer is, I can't imagine it. So I can imagine almost anything, including, yes, the Earth is just a place to come and enjoy the local natives and or what have you. But it really means that almost anything is possible, to be honest. So I find it difficult. My mind does begin to reel, actually, when I think about billion-year civilizations.
Well, so a lot of people will say something like, what would a technology be like that's 1 billion years in advance of us? I say, hey, I don't need 1 billion years. Give me 1,000 years. And if you don't think that would be kind of amazing, just think back 1,000 years and hand some guy living in the 11th century a light bulb, let alone a generator or a nuclear power plant.
I have an answer.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that may have been left out of the famous Drake equation about trying to estimate what fraction of solar systems have planets, what fraction of those planets have life, blah, 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 is that technical civilizations may only last 1,000 years or 10,000 years. You know, that I don't know. I'm not sure we can be that optimistic about our own culture, what we're seeing.
It's true. We may replace
and whether we get off the Earth and get out there before we use up all the resources. I mean, we may only have one shot at doing that. So it may be that the fraction of cultures that are around long enough to be interested is small. Plus, then there's the evolutionary window that, you know, you're only a species for 10 million years. That's kind of the turnover time for evolution. So the idea that cultures, once they achieve space travel, remain interested in everybody else, you know, seems small to me. I don't think that's probably likely.
I guess the point is simply that Fermi's paradox is a bigger paradox now than it was 50, 60 years ago when Fermi first made his famous quip. So we've got to face up to it, and I think that the problem is that the scientific community is unwilling to consider the possibility that in this giant morass, which is the field of UFO reports, that there might be lurking some really valid signal. It's just a mindset that can't be, and I think that's actually to the detriment of science.
I and Bernie Haish, Bruce Maccabee, Jim Deardorff put together a paper for the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society, which is a very well-respected journal, and first covered we began with Fermi's paradox, you know, famous claimed expression by Fermi, which did take place when he said, well, all astrophysicists looking out at all those stars and all those galaxies know that unless we want to really be pumped up with hubris, there's got to be other ET civilizations out there. Furthermore, if you look at the statistics of travel, even if you're very conservative and say you can't beat the speed of light, and each time you go to a new star, you stay there for 1 million years before you go off to look at another star, nonetheless, you end up saying the galaxy should be colonized by now. Because after all, we're a relatively young star. We're less than 4 billion years old. We've got stars in our galaxy 10 billion years old. That's plenty of time for us to be colonized, so where are they? And the answer at the time, this is back in, 40s, 50s, was, well, probably speed of light limitation. So looking at that, we said, okay, well, that limitation now has begun to evaporate due to the new understandings and predictions coming out of general relativity. So that's not the issue. Well, what about what Condon said in his report? Well, that's not really an issue either, because we now have better data, better sightings, more evidence. So it finally came down to, at least in that paper, we talked about a couple of cases that Bruce Maccabee had been directly involved in investigating that seemed pretty good. And then you finally get to the issue of, well, if that's the case, then why don't we see the evidence? Well, you can claim that UFO sightings are possibly evidence, but of course that hasn't met the scientific standard of really being proven. And then the question is, well, if they're kind of here but they're not showing themselves, why is that? One possibility is that if you're a super advanced race, you've got super advanced technology, what's of value to you? You don't need slaves, you don't need minerals out of the ground, you don't need this, you don't need that. You can basically make whatever you want. So the only thing of value would be the intellectual property and creativity of an uncontaminated species. Uncontaminated. Uncontaminated being the key. So they show up here and say, whoa, internal combustion machine. Who would have thought of that? Or look at those musical scales. Now that's really something. And but the minute they land and we shake their hands, 100 years were them, and we've lost our value. And also, as we know from interacting with primitive societies, the shock can disrupt the society. Presumably they would know that too. So what Deerdorf likes to point out is that, okay, they're not going to make themselves immediately known for obvious reasons, because it would destroy our value to them. On the other hand, and it would be a shock. And on the other hand, they know it's only a matter of time, even if it's only when we get our own spaceships, go out there and run into them. So we do have to kind of be brought along in our maturity to accept this as a possibility. And so kind of a covert peekaboo process would be the favored one. And, that could be the case. Obviously, we don't know for sure.
There's almost nothing I can think of good that would come from landing and making contact with another civilization that is not either comparable to yours in development or is so sophisticated that they can handle it. And when you think about the scenarios we can all dream of, science fiction, about contacting, in other words, we're the aliens and we have this ability to travel. We develop this technology. We start flying around the galaxy. We encounter another civilization that's less advanced than us. Would we land? And the answer is, I certainly would not.
I certainly wouldn't.
Yeah. And I won't go through the long list of bad things that can happen, but it is a long list. And so it, by the way, raises the question of when could contact even occur. When you think about it that way, and you realize that despite all the science fiction stuff, in fact, I think that societies would pull back from contact and not do it. When does it happen, actually? And that, to me, is the more profound question. And I don't have an answer to that.
There is an awful lot of assuming that they would be like us, and I tend to fall into that trap frequently.
Pretty hard.
And it's very hard not to do it. It may be, of course, that if the extraterrestrial intelligence were sufficiently different from us, we would not recognize it. We would not know it was there. We couldn't make sense of it, and possibly vice versa. Yeah. But certainly we don't know how technology is going to progress. Right now, it seems to be accelerating, going very, very fast. Will it level off? Will it taper? Will there be various plateaus? But the differentness of extraterrestrial intelligence is something that has to be taken into account when we think about the possibilities of contact and if contact is going to occur. And, we might not notice it. I mean, sad but true.
Well, there could be good reasons why they don't say hello. It could be that they're trying to keep our civilization from suddenly imploding because we're encountering something that's beyond our ability to assimilate. It could be that this is part of the plan to bring a new civilization into the fold, to gradually expose the phenomenon. I think that there are a lot of reasons why they wouldn't just come and land here if they so chose.
Our own experience with South Pacific civilizations encountering European technology, in the 19th century, should answer the question. I mean, those civilizations were practically destroyed.
Well, in fact, it's true. When we encountered ourselves more primitive civilizations, we tended to destroy them, but it may be even more severe than that. I mean, we don't tend to try to initiate contact with a group of ants, do we? We don't know how far advanced a civilization might be. I'd be surprised if we were tens of thousands, but certainly decades or even centuries I would see as a possible timescale for making contact known. If you look at UFO reports, they're oftentimes extremely convincing to the people who see them, who witness them, but the event never lasts long enough, never has enough exposure to sort of rise to the surface of national attention. And it could be that is part of a deliberate strategy. I mean, that could be one way to gradually make us collectively as a civilization realize that there's more to reality than what we experience every day around us, but without suddenly upsetting the whole apple cart, without suddenly sort of challenging all of our structures and our politics and our economics, which could be very devastating.
Here's another thought. Maybe it's already taking place. Maybe that, flying around or whatever in a kind of liminal way, right at the margins of our reality, is in fact the first step towards a contact. That contact would not be something which would be abrupt, but maybe is designed to take place over thousands of years, so that the impact on us is...
Yeah, this is actually how, if I were in charge, how I would manage contact. And this is sort of getting back to this idea of the dawning realization that, if everyone reaches the same conclusion at once, it would be very exciting. If slowly more and more people are drawn into one position or the other, and then finally there's just a very small group of holdouts that maintain a contrary view. Why, in the case of something like contact, if we're talking about civilizations billions of years older than us, what would be the rush? In modern North America, we're always in a rush. We wouldn't think of building a cathedral, say, over a period of 800 years, as was done in medieval times, give or take a few years. But if something were truly momentous, then indeed it could take place very, very slowly over many people's lifetimes. And what this would mean, if it were to take place over many people's lifetimes, is that there would always be a growing group of people who quote, think something's going on, with a lot of other people who still don't agree with them. But why would there be a rush requirement in something as delicate and portentous, you might say, as contacting another civilization?
Well, this becomes more just trite, which is that you're ready for it. I mean, you're really ready for it, meaning that you are at such a level that it will not affect your social mores, it will not affect your technological underpinnings, because in fact, the best way for aliens to completely screw us up is to land here and say, here's the box for free energy, go use it. And all of a sudden, everything here just falls apart. Why there have to be gasoline stations? Oh, gee, all those people just lost their jobs. And why? I mean, you just go on and on and on, and the whole place becomes a nightmare of, So you have to have a society that can handle this contact, whatever that means. And I can just conceive of it in my 21st century, small human mind here, which I don't think is big enough necessarily to get our arms around it. But I do think we're a long way away from it. But what would be the appropriate moment for contact? And so that's another reason why I'm pessimistic. I used about scientists. I think I'm realistic about whether or not we can expect contact. And my realism says no, actually.
It's an interesting set of challenges. I personally am not as worried about these sort of fierce, destructive aliens as a lot of people are, because I think what we're finding out through political science is that there are a lot of forces that tend to put really aggressive societies out of business. And it's not a popular message when I talk to people who've read the morning paper. It's less popular now with what's going on in the Mideast, but there's a lot of growing evidence within political science on the kinds of conditions that lead to peaceful coexistence and why they're likely to prevail. And what I have to do as a psychologist is, if I'm trying to imagine what ET might be like, is while being aware of the problem of anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism and so forth, is to try to say, okay, now what's out there that seems to be pretty robust? What is there out there that we have learned that applies in different historical epochs, that cuts across cultures and may cut across species? And those are the things that I see as fairly useful hypotheses, to try to follow up.
Such as?
Interstellar tit-for-tat or negotiation. That if in fact you find a communicative civilization, and if in fact there is a way to communicate in a time frame that's meaningful, what you do is you indicate an interest in collaboration and getting along, sharing information and so forth, but you don't just sort of give it all away at once. You wait for some sort of reciprocal concession. It's known as the Golden Rule. It's known as tit for tat. There's a number of other names for it. It appears in science. It appears in biology. It appears in social science. It appears in religion. And given the universality of reciprocal relationships, that's one way to start thinking about bargaining or interacting with ET.